Hello and welcome to our Voices in Montessori podcast, brought to you by the Greenspring Center for Lifelong Learning. As Dr. Montessori tells us, an education capable of saving humanity is no small undertaking. We agree, so let's get to work. I'm Tamara Sheesley Balis, and in today's episode, we're talking about dual language education in Montessori schools, how to start it, what the challenges are, and what the different types of models can look like. My guest today is Gabrielle Kotkov. Gabrielle is an AMI 3 to 6 Montessori educator, consultant, and the founder of Multilingual Montessori and the host of the Multilingual Montessori podcast. She has worked in Montessori schools in New York, London, and Austin, Texas. She holds a bachelor's degree in Italian from Vassar College, a master's degree in child studies from Linköping University in Sweden, and a TESOL certificate from the Teachers College in Columbia University. As a recipient of a Fulbright grant, she spent a year teaching English to Italian high schoolers in Catania, Sicily. She lives in Brooklyn, New York. Welcome, Gabrielle. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm so looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I am too.
It's such an important conversation, and so often in the United States, especially, we have children who really only have one language, yet this is how we become people of the world, is to be able to speak to people in all their different tongues. So I'm really excited to talk about how we do that in our schools, our Montessori school communities. So let's start out. Some listeners may not even know. Talk about the different models of bilingual education.
Yeah. So I think it's a great point what you said about in the United States, we really don't have widespread access to bilingual education, and that's so important. So I hope that this conversation inspires some people to start a program if that's a possibility. So there are different models of bilingual education to keep in mind, and the kind of gold standard is the enrichment model. And that is where we're trying to teach two different languages, and they have equal weight and equal importance. And we're really trying to get children to be both bilingual and biliterate. So that means that they learn to read and write in both languages as well. And instruction is usually in two languages, one at a time. And children are encouraged to interact with each other in both languages as well. And a version of that is a heritage model, where this is in communities where it might be used to support the rejuvenation of an indigenous language, or a language that has been lost or is in the process of dying out. So it's a way to rejuvenate that language and make it part of the community again. And this has been used in many different places, from Hawaii to Ireland to New Zealand, and that we won't really talk too much about that today, but it's a really cool model to be aware of. Then two models that are less popular and less ideal, so I won't spend too much time talking about them, is the maintenance model, where a student's first language is maintained as kind of the basis for second language learning, but the first language isn't necessarily expanded upon. So you might have a community of children who don't speak the majority language, and so their first language is used as a way to transition them into the majority language academic studies.
Mm-hmm.
And then the transitional model used to be used very commonly in the US, and it really is, going out of style for good reason. And that's because the aim of that really is monolingualism. There historically have been programs that called themselves bilingual, but that was because they were kind of reaching a group of students whose first language wasn't English. And so they might start out doing instruction in both languages, but then they would phase out the other language that was not English with the goal of English fluency. So that isn't as ideal, of course, a situation we want to uphold and maintain and expand on both languages evenly.
Mm-hmm. hmm And so, so you're really recommending the heritage model? Is that correct?
The
What
enrichment model.
the enrichment model? Okay.
Yeah, the heritage model is kind of like a subset of the enrichment model.
Okay. And so then in the enrichment model, which you're recommending, tell us what that would look like inside a Montessori classroom.
Yeah. So one version of the enrichment model, you can do it in a couple of different ways, but one version is a dual language or two-way immersion program. So in a Montessori classroom, let's see, there's so many different qualifications I have to make. So this might look different in a children's house primary level versus elementary. Many schools will choose, while the goal eventually is 50-50 instruction in both languages, many schools choose to kind of front load the minority language. So they might do 90-10 instruction in the preschool years so that children really have that strong foundation in the language that is not English, if it's in the US, for example, while they still have an absorbent mind and they're really absorbing all of that language input. Then eventually by upper elementary, it would kind of even out as far as the language of instruction to about 50-50. So some Montessori programs choose to have a lead guide speaking one language and an assistant speaking another language. But the risk of that is that whichever language the lead guide is speaking to the children, that's the language that the lessons are given in. But you really want lessons given in both languages, or if it's in children's house, you want lessons given in the minority language of the community so that children really get that input. A lot of schools will choose to have, if that is available to them, will choose to have staff be bilingual for the most part, but then pick a language that each teacher is speaking to the children. Some classrooms will have like a Spanish language guide and an English language guide so that the children understand which language to speak to each adult, but both are qualified to give lessons in both languages.
Now, in that model, though, if we're trying to do 90-10, I would assume that with 90-10, you would really need both people in the classroom to be fluent in the target language. There's no way to do 90-10 if somebody speaks English and somebody speaks Spanish. Then you're really going to 50. So
yes, you're right. So like in an elementary classroom, for example, you might have an English guide and a Spanish guide if that's the target language. But you're right. In a 90-10 model, English would only be used kind of to help the children transition into Spanish, especially like when they join, to help their just overall transition and feeling comfortable in the community, like speaking English words to them if that's their home language. But Spanish really would be used. I'm using Spanish and English as an example, but Spanish really would be used as the language of instruction and the language that they hear spoken all around them.
So just we have at Greenspring Montessori, we have a dual language program, and we have a toddler, children's house, and lower L. And just for context for our listeners, we approach it a little differently. We're not able to, it's a staffing issue, right? Our target language is Spanish, and we have really struggled to find Spanish speaking Montessori guides. We have sent our own to training, and that's been effective for sure. But our community would love for the dual language to go up through upper L and then through adolescence. And we just haven't had the capacity to maintain that because of staffing. So our model is different because of that. And so we have at least one fluent Spanish speaker in the classroom. At the toddler level, they're assistants. So we have two, toddler classrooms and they're assistants. and their role is to speak in Spanish consistently throughout the day, unless it's regarding discipline. Like if a child is spinning or struggling, we find that the child does not respond well if we're using the target language. They need somebody to be able to speak to them and say, hey, I see that you're upset right now, and, let's connect. And so, and if they're hearing that in Spanish, they tend to not respond. So that's one of the pieces that we really have taken on. But other than that, they're speaking in Spanish. And what we have found is they have to be giving direct instruction in the target language. So we have one lead guide and 2 assistants in our toddler classrooms. And so the toddler assistant, who is the Spanish speaking dual language person, is consistently giving direct instruction in Spanish and speaking Spanish. And we've had pretty extraordinary results with that, especially as we had somebody come in who'd been a Spanish teacher before. And so it's been really extraordinary to watch how much the toddlers learn. Then circle time, there's songs in Spanish, and that is reinforced that way. And then at the Children's House level, we found we have that same model, but we only have one assistant in the classroom, and it wasn't working. Our children weren't getting enough Spanish because the assistant was so focused on the Montessori-ness, and working in the classroom, that they couldn't offer those direct instruction. It was really challenging for them. So we ended up having having one person in the classroom who is coming in. We hired finally somebody just to do dual language for our 3 dual language classrooms, 2 Children's House and 1 lower elementary. We have somebody who comes in and then does, at the Children's House level, 5 hours a week, 6 hours a week, direct instruction in Spanish with small groups. And then we have a Spanish speaker in there all the time reinforcing it. And then at the lower L, same thing. The assistant is dual language, is Spanish speaking. The lead guide doesn't speak Spanish, but she has been practicing so hard, and her Spanish, she's taken it on. Last year, she really started. It's been amazing how much she's learned. Like she's beginning to be proficient, and she had 0 Spanish. So adults, just so you know, it can be done. And the children, it's like they're all in it together, which is just this beautiful experience. But anyway, the dual language guide goes in and does 10 hours a week at the lower L level of direct instruction, and has Spanish lunches in all 3 of those classrooms, and takes the lower L out onto field trips where there's only Spanish. And so it's really given us access to having those children make a lot more progress once we had a dedicated person who was really supporting those classrooms. Now, I know all schools are not in our situation. We're bigger than a lot of Montessori schools. We have the capacity to do that. But I did want to offer that because what I don't want is for people to hear that you have to have a lead guide who speaks the target language and then get stopped, because this is too important for us to get stopped. Not that it's not always easy to find assistants who speak Spanish either. And initially we had 2 people on campus that really spoke Spanish well. And now we have at least a dozen. It's amazing how we've become magnetic in that way. And so I just wanted to add that. Been going on a while here.
Yeah.
Wanted to offer the framework of our program, which looks a little different because, and the other thing is, we made a decision really early that it was Montessori first and then dual language. And you do have to decide that as a school community. I know school communities, there's one in downtown Baltimore who chose language first and then Montessori. You have to decide, because sometimes there are going to be things that you have to make a decision for. And we decided Montessori was always going to be our first priority, and then the language. So
no, I think that's a really great point to bring up, that you do absolutely have to decide as a school community if it's going to be Montessori first or dual language first. And there's no wrong choice, but that I think has to be kind of your guiding principle, because then everything else is going to come from that decision. And I should have also started out by saying that there's, just as we talk about in Montessori teacher training, we talk about the child and like what, the, not, I don't want to say the word ideal, but like the, I can't think of another word, so I'm going to use it, but I don't mean ideal as the best, but like the kind of generic child and what you might expect their development to be. And then of course you have real children that you work with every day that are individuals. And the same goes for dual language programs. So there's the models, and then there's what you can actually do in your school. And you're right. I also don't want anybody to get discouraged if they hear this model and they say, well, we don't have enough, Spanish trained guides, so we can't do it. Mm-hmm. You're right that there's so many different ways to approach it, and absolutely doing what you can and offering the children any kind of dual language opportunity is better than not. And that's a really amazing thing to offer as well. And different schools will approach the teaching models differently based on who they have. If they have the resources to send guides to training, that's amazing. Just I think the most important thing to think about is creating a bilingual culture in your school where bilingualism is just the community. So everything is bilingual. All parent events are bilingual. Parent communications are bilingual. Staff meetings are bilingual. Cultural events at the school are bilingual, so that both children and their families will kind of get that language input from all sides. And when you were talking about the lead guide who was learning Spanish, that's also an amazing model of bilingualism for the children to see. They see an adult who is struggling to learn a language, and that no one is perfect, and that you can learn a language at any stage in your life. So I think that's also something really beautiful for young children to absorb and experience.
Well, and I give her so much credit because she's so courageous and she's out there using it, like with parents in Carline and with Spanish speakers and non-Spanish speakers. She's in it. And it's just absolutely such a role model for all of us, the children, for parents, for staff. It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. So, yeah. So I think the other piece I just want to add is, as you're talking about kind of the model and how do you do this, is that for us, when we started out, I started out my second year here at Greenspring. So we've had the program for 11 years. And the first year I could not find a Spanish speaking guide because I still thought I had to have a Spanish speaking guide. And so I called every training center that I could find. I finally found a guide who was just graduating from training in Texas. I brought her in. She did not like Maryland. She made it through 1 year. And then here we were, right? And so I strongly recommend that there be a base built with folks that you have, right? That you are in the community already. And that has made it, and you grow slowly, right? It's little by little. So we then we put together a team, where actually we had a Spanish speaking person who could take the Children's House community. And then we got an assistant. We made the mistake originally of having assistants who didn't really speak enough Spanish. They spoke some, but it wasn't really enough. So they would revert to English all the time. And they couldn't hold the Spanish and really be speaking Spanish when the guide was speaking English. So we learned that lesson. We started out really inexpensive. I think the first year it was free because we figured it out, and then it went to $300 a year for, between $250 and $450, depending on the level. And then this last year when we hired the full-time person, and it's a lot, but I believe our lower L is $1,200 for the year to have this extra piece because we had to actually pay for somebody. So for context, some pieces for schools to consider is you can offset the cost of this. We also give our dual language people a stipend, right? Because it's more work. And we have a stipend if you're a non-Spanish speaking lead guide in a dual language classroom, or if you're a Spanish speaking guide, there's more, like we really try to honor and take care of those folks because it is more work. Those assistants come to conferences, right? They're a part of the conferences. There's a conference offered by the dual language guide for all of Lower L. They can sign up for a conference with the Montessori guide and then a separate conference with her just to talk about Spanish. So we really are trying to incorporate it fully. We did, by the way, make all of our building signs are in Spanish and English. But here's my question for you. We went within the community, it was, because we have villages, we call them villages, right? So is it villa or pueblo?
Oh, that's
right?
a great question. Right.
I don't tell me because I don't want to be.
No, I don't know. I don't know. It's certainly not for me to say, but that is a really interesting question, especially in a language like Spanish that has so many different variations all around the world.
Yeah, for a while, we were really trying to do the work of distinguishing, okay, we're going to use this word for this. And I have Spanish speakers from Colombia, Peru, Venezuela, Mexico. I mean, we have this beautiful rainbow array of Latinas. And we finally decided that what we're saying is people have asked us, parents ask us, well, what kind of Spanish are you teaching? And we say, we teach the Spanish that person has. And so we are going to have differences. The way they call their backpack, I think it's mochila, and then we have all these different terms for even backpack. And that's okay because children are absorbent, and we're not going to try to come up with one term it's too many words. And there's a richness that comes out of having that array of people and that array of backgrounds. And it really is beautiful. So yes. Okay. So
yeah.
So talk to us about the things to consider when starting a dual language program. We've talked about some of them probably already, but please.
Yeah. So one of them that we kind of have talked about is the staff that you're able to hire and what kind of access you have to adults who speak the target language as their first language or fluently. It doesn't have to be their first language. And whether they're Montessori trained, whether you're able to send them to Montessori training. Okay, actually, before that, the one thing we talked about, the starting point is Montessori the first consideration or is dual language the first consideration? And both are valid models, but you do have to decide that as your school community. Then you have to think about the staffing that you have access to and whether you can send adults to training. And of course, that is always, you never know what's going to happen in someone's life, whether they're going to move or, decide to leave the classroom. So you might think you have this staff member and then you lose them, like you were saying. So not everything is predictable, but thinking about who you have access to, how you can retain them, and what other approaches you can take if you can't have exactly the makeup of a teaching staff that might be your ideal, how you can work with the community that you already have. Then I think it's important to consider the home languages of the students and the community that you're serving. Do most of your students speak English at home and they're learning the target language? Do most students speak the target language at home and they're learning English? Or do many students come from a bilingual home? So thinking about that as well, that doesn't necessarily have to affect the instruction and the model. But it's important to think about what you're offering to the community at parent events and that sort of thing. And thinking about what languages in a particular classroom might need maybe a little more extra time. Like you might, if you have a community that's largely Spanish speaking, learning English, you might not do a 90-10 model in primary. But if you have a community that's mostly English speaking at home, learning Spanish, then you might want to do a 90-10, preschool community. Another thing to think about, which is not necessarily in your control, but to think about what's going to happen after they leave your class or your school. Are there bilingual opportunities in middle school or high school in your larger community in your city? It might not be a Montessori program, but are there schools that you can connect with, that you can have a relationship with, that you can sort of lead families to if they're interested in continuing that bilingual education? And if not, what other ways can you offer families continuation of a language support? Maybe connecting with a cultural center in the area. Maybe even if you have the resources to offer optional language classes for high schoolers. For example, if your school goes up to middle school, maybe you don't have a high school, but maybe you have, graduates of the middle school program coming back for language classes, if that's something that the community is interested in. So just thinking about, is it going to end at upper L? And if it does, then what happens after that? And what ways can you continue to support the community? We think of in the quote perfect or ideal bilingual model that children would have at least 5 years in this immersion program. But of course, more is better. If there's a way for them to continue through high school, that is amazing. And of course, many high schools offer foreign languages, but a language study a couple times a week in high school is not going to be the same as their dual language program in elementary or middle school.
And you use it or lose it.
Yes, exactly. So
Right.
they'll still have this foundation, even if they stop studying, but of course we want them to keep using it and have that input and conversational opportunities as often as possible.
And I hear often from people who learned a language as a child and then they say they forgot it. Now it comes back much more quickly because those neural pathways are built, but my understanding is they have started to prune some and they don't have the quickness. You really have to kind of pull it up from the recesses. So we actually share with folks who are coming into the program that if they want their child to have it long term, they have to be committed to having something to do, like, for example, in high school, or we go up through 8th grade, so they can have Spanish with us at a pretty high level through 8th grade, and then they have to choose Spanish and take Spanish, right? And really be still in the conversation. So can you tell us some of the challenges that dual language communities, and then for those of you who are listening at home, then we're going to talk about how to transition a monolingual Montessori environment into a dual language environment. But I do want to find out, like from you do this with schools, you support schools in this work. What are the challenges? Because what we know is when we state challenges, when we're starting on a project, and we own what the challenges and the obstacles are going to be, and we talk about them and how to overcome them, we're much more likely to be successful in our project. So what are the things that you see schools come up against?
So one common question I get is that children understand the target language, but maybe are not speaking it, or they're speaking it to the adults, but they're not using it socially with each other. And I think that is okay. And that is going to happen. So people can expect that to be something that happens on the way to bilingualism, on the way to children using the language socially. And so I do, that's why I mentioned before, really having bilingualism just part of the school community, because when the children, observe Spanish being spoken at all events and amongst the parent community, that is really their model for social bilingualism. So oftentimes schools will see academic bilingualism, but not social bilingualism. So not forcing it, of course, but providing opportunities for children to use it socially. And this also will depend on what your student body is, which language they're speaking. But I always tell people to not worry too much if it's not happening yet, but just to try to allow for those opportunities to happen kind of naturally. And one thing I wanted to mention before that I forgot to say is things to consider when thinking about a dual language program is to think about how you're supporting the parent community as well. And I think that is also really going to help children's social use of the language. If you're providing opportunities for parents who speak either language at home to learn the other language, or if, offering resources to refer them to if you can't offer the resources in your school. But if your school, in heritage language schools, oftentimes they will have language classes at night for parents. Like, for example, I've heard about a school in Hawaii that is not a Montessori school, but they are revitalizing the Hawaiian language, but the parent community doesn't speak Hawaiian. Like the parents' parents or grandparents were fluent in Hawaiian, but by the parents' generation, it has been lost. And so the children are learning Hawaiian during the day in school, but then the parents are learning Hawaiian at night. And so if you're able to offer that opportunity for parents to learn Spanish or English or whichever language is, not their home language, then that is kind of laying the groundwork for it to be spoken outside of school and in social contexts. And then the children observe that and will also engage in the target language outside of the classroom. Yeah. And so another challenge is, like language, grammar and spelling and reading and writing, of course, should be taught in both languages. But then you have to decide as a school, are subjects going to be divided between languages? Are subjects going to be taught in both languages? And when is each language used? Do you have a Spanish time of day and an English time of day? Do you have a Spanish day of the week and an English day of the week? This also might differ based on the staff that you have. So there's no right answer, but those are considerations to keep in mind that might change throughout the years. But I would recommend kind of picking an approach and sticking with it for the school year, because otherwise it's just going to be so confusing for staff and children if you start out doing something and 3 months later then you say, well, let's change it up a little. But there is no right answer. It's kind of what your school community needs and what you are able to do with the staff that you have. So I know I feel bad that I'm not being very specific, but each individual school and school community has different needs and different resources.
So that is absolutely true. So in our school community, we don't go into, like, we're not teaching math in Spanish. However, there is focus once they get to lower elementary on writing. One of the distinctions and reading. One of the distinctions we made early on, and I think I got this out of the book, Your Bilingual Child, but is that we can't, you can't teach them to read in two languages at once. So they have to have mastered one language of reading before they move into the other. And, mastery, we've had a lot of conversations about what does mastery really mean, but for us, it was really they're functional readers. And then they're able to go in and read in another language. Because one of the things that anybody who's looking at doing any kind of dual language program should know is when you start teaching another language, there can be delays in acquisition. So it may delay their reading some. It may delay their language intake because they're having to learn 2 words for apple rather than just one. And so we have found that we focus specifically on expressive language and understanding receptive language and expressive language in Children's House, a toddler in Children's House and then when the child has reading mastered in kindergarten, then they can move into reading and writing in Spanish as well. And so that's seemed to be helpful as a distinction for us internally, because now I also know that the Lamb School, which is in Washington, D.C., which is a bilingual community that has been doing this for quite a long time, they're a charter school. They have classrooms like you talked about. They have in the morning, it's only, I think it's Spanish. And in the afternoon, it's only English. And they have all their lessons in the target language and then in the native language or non-native. They have a very international community there, but in English and then in Spanish. And their children are incredibly bilingual. It works beautifully. And they have a very, I think part of where at least talking to them, part of where there can be some challenge is the communication between the 2 rooms. That's a lot of, you have 2 really lead guides who are functioning in 2 different rooms who are serving the child, which is a lot, that takes a lot of communication. I'm giving them this lesson and this, all of those pieces. So for what it's worth, there are so many different ways to do this. And we want to make sure that people have some of this information. When I started out, I had, just reading books and trying to figure it out so we could get it going, because I know it's important. And so it's good there are people like you who are consultants and can help people who want to start, because we certainly did not have that, and it would have been very helpful.
Yeah, you bring up such a good point about reading and writing in one language first. And I think it's so important to understand that children will only learn the process of reading one time, no matter how many languages they speak, even if the languages have a different written alphabet system or characters. The process of our brains attaching a sound to a symbol and then putting those symbols together to make a word, that is something that, isn't inherent. Like speaking is something that we naturally do, but reading is something that we have to be taught to do, but we only have to learn it once. And it is easier if a child learns to read in one language and then will learn, we still build up the oral language input and output in both languages, but the reading and writing, when it happens in one language first, then they have that strong foundation, or foundation doesn't have to be a strong foundation yet. And then you add in the reading and writing in the second language. And I don't necessarily mean that it has to be their second language. There are different approaches to this as well. Some people feel that teaching a student to read and write in their first language is, a good approach first because that's their stronger language. Some people take the approach of teaching reading and writing in the more difficult language first. So by difficult, I mean non-phonetic. So Spanish is a pretty phonetic language for the most part. Words are spelled like they sound. English, not so much. So in between English and Spanish, English would be the harder language to read and write. Between English and French French is the harder language to read and write. French is less phonetic than English is. So again, there's no right or wrong, but and actually, let me give you one more example. I once worked with a bilingual school that was English and French, and parents in the Children's House community would choose which language they wanted their child to learn to read and write in first, based on what school they were going to next. So this school didn't have an elementary program, so students would either go to an English language or a French language school, and whichever language they were going to continue their schooling in is the language that they would learn to read and write in first. So there's no right or wrong approach, but having that clarity on which student is learning which language for reading and writing first, I think is very helpful. And when they're able to build a foundation in reading and writing in one language, when they understand the connection between symbols and the words that we speak, then they can add in another language to that after.
That makes a lot of sense. And we want to recognize that the child is also, I mean, they're learning so many things and they're so capable, right? The brain, I think Chomsky said that a child can learn 7 languages simultaneously and be able to speak a language to each, you know, speak Italian to you and French to you and Spanish to you. And it's pretty remarkable, their capability. And so we have to really feed that.
Yeah, it is. And we also shouldn't let our adult minds get in the way, because of course it's harder for adults to learn languages, but we shouldn't, put unnecessary limitations on children because they are so capable. One example I remember from my teacher training that's not related to bilingualism, but I remember my trainer saying, a word for a child is just a word. There's no hard words or easy words. It's just a word. So if you can think of a child who knows all the names of every dinosaur, I don't know all the names of every dinosaur, but I've met many 3 and 4-year-olds in my day who can tell you the name of every dinosaur, many syllables in all of these words. So for them, it's just a word, and they love it, and they're in that absorbent mind and sensitive period for language. So we do really want to feed that.
I absolutely, I love that. I think a word is just a word, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so talk to us about how we transition a monolingual Montessori environment into a dual language environment.
Yes. So of course, this is going to look different based on the staff that you have. But if you have a monolingual environment that you want to transition into a dual language, you have to keep in mind this is going to be a multi-year process. This is not going to happen in 1 year or 2 years. It may not happen until the children who are the youngest children in your class have left your class and you have a whole new group of children. I think the first thing to think about is what your ideal staffing arrangement would be and what you realistically can have now. And those things might not be the same. Like we talked about before, I think it's important to think about how you can support your current staff to become bilingual or to use both languages if they have both languages now. So things to think about: the ideal staffing, the ideal balance between languages throughout the day or throughout the week, and then be willing to adjust that if it's not working for your community now. I feel like I'm speaking in a lot of general terms, but it is hard to give specifics like this is the way to do it, because every school is going to be different and every school community and their needs are going to be different. So, for example, if you have a classroom that you want to be, so just an example, you might have an English speaking guide and you might have an assistant who has been speaking English to the children, but speaks Spanish. Maybe the assistant starts speaking in Spanish to the children 90-10. She might still use English, like you said, for difficult moments when the children really need the support, or when they're, coming into the classroom, getting to know each other. But you might have that assistant start speaking in Spanish, and then you might have somebody else coming in and starting to give lessons in Spanish, and incorporating songs and books in Spanish into the classroom. And maybe that's your first year. And that's okay, that you've made that transition. Spanish is something that they're hearing around them. Then maybe if one of the teaching staff leaves, then maybe you hire somebody who speaks Spanish and English if you're able to find a good fit. And then maybe some lessons start to be given in Spanish. I don't think that it's realistic to make a switch within 1 year from English language to 90-10 Spanish. That's something you could do if you're opening a new classroom. But I think starting young, like you wouldn't, if you have a toddler program, you would want to start with the toddler program. You wouldn't necessarily be able to start with lower elementary if children have never had Spanish before. You'd want to start with direct instruction in Spanish, like a Spanish teacher visiting the classroom, giving lessons in Spanish. In elementary, you wouldn't want to start with, both teachers speaking Spanish most of the time, because children would be a little lost if they don't have any Spanish. So thinking about what the needs of your community are and what you're able to offer with teaching staff, I think, is the starting point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I hope that's helpful. I know that it's not very specific, but I think that you have to think about what you want to offer, what you can offer now, and kind of how to eventually make those meet, but giving yourself grace if you're not able to make those meet yet.
Well, and knowing that every journey, right, starts with small steps. And so a small step and a small step, when we're hiring, we always give preference to people who speak Spanish, even if we don't have a role for them yet as a Spanish speaker in the community. If they speak Spanish, because that's the target language. And what I know is the ideal in a bilingual community, and we kind of raised on this but not really dug into it, is that you would have 50% of the students in the classroom speaking the target language and 50% speaking, for us, it's English. And so that they're, and that they're teaching each other, and it's part of the culture. And so you have the English speakers getting to teach the Spanish speakers, and Spanish speaker teaching English teachers. So for us, when we have children who are native Spanish speakers, we also give them priority admissions. And we are really looking to have that influx in our community, have those folks who can support the community in that way. And that's made a big difference as well. And it's a big undertaking. I don't want anybody to think that it's not. I can't tell you, one of the challenges that we didn't touch on is classroom placement. So we have 3 Children's House classrooms that are non-dual language and 2 that are. And they feed into one lower L classroom that is dual language and one that's not. Yet sometimes we have children who we need to separate because they do better apart. All of a sudden, a child may be in a dual language program that hasn't had the background, or the family really wants dual language, but like there are those pieces as well that we have to know about. They're important to consider, but it's worth it. Right? It's so worth it when the children are speaking Spanish. And I hear from families all the time, oh, so, my son came home and just started talking and telling us all the names and all the Spanish. They're doing, parts of speech, and they're doing the nouns, and they're all in Spanish. And it means that they're going into the world better prepared to be a global citizen. And isn't that what we're all about, right? Isn't that what we're doing in the world, is creating a more peaceful planet? And part of that is that we cannot have it be that we expect everyone to speak English and do it our way. It's so egocentric. We've got to be out. We've got to be building these skills. We've got to be supporting children and families in that important work. So, we are almost out of time. I just wanted to see what else, like, you drop any more wisdom you want to drop on us before we sign off today.
No, I think what you said about making children, growing them into global citizens is so important. And even just exposing children to another language, even if they don't graduate from your school with perfect fluency, they can continue to study it if they choose to, but they'll have that awareness of other cultures and appreciation of lifestyles that are not what they grew up with in their home. And so that is so important to have that awareness and curiosity about other people and other languages and other communities. And that, I think, is really what we want to foster. And I think that when schools are able to offer bilingualism in a way that doesn't prioritize one language over another or one culture over another, I think that children will really have that kind of in their souls. Their observant minds will take it in, and that will carry on with them throughout their lives, whether or not they choose to continue studying and speaking both languages.
That's so beautiful. I love the thought of it being in the soul. And I wanted to add one more piece that I realized I didn't share that we're doing that I think is really important. We're in the throes of creating it right now, but our adolescent community, we're working on building a sister school with a school in Mexico. And so ideally, right, because we've been doing cultural celebrations, Dia de Santos, we've been really infusing as much of the Latina culture into the school community as we can. And it's growing all the time. We're not perfect by any means, but really giving them the students a pinnacle, a reason to have that Spanish where they can, right now they go to the Spanish market, they go to places and only speak Spanish, but it's not the same as going and being in the culture. So that in either 7th or 8th grade, they will have a trip to Mexico. And the ideal is that they are housed with students from that Montessori school, and they're only speaking Spanish. And then the following year, those students come and we house them and they only speak English. And you have this beautiful exchange and the opportunity to see this other culture and experience it. And so we have a sweet, beautiful school that we've found and that we're working on building this with. And because we want them to have the opportunity to use it. Now, those of you who have school communities that don't go through adolescence, there's no pressure around this, right? It doesn't, but just these beautiful opportunities for the children to have that experience, because as you said, it's for a lifetime. This is for a lifetime, and it changes their perspective on what it means to learn somebody else's language. And, we have international children who are learning 3 or 4 languages at once. We can learn at least one more. We can do it.
Absolutely. Oh, that's beautiful. I can't wait to see how that program grows and expands. What a wonderful opportunity.
Well, the interesting thing is they were doing it 20 years ago. This is not a new idea. And there's a school in Texiclan, I hope I'm saying that right, was partnering with a school, I believe, in Chicago for a number of years, and then kind of it fizzled out. And so it's not a new idea, but gosh, we're so excited to have this community that we can build these relationships with from the time they're young, and then they get to go see these people and experience their culture and their life. And because isn't that just so enriching and such a beautiful opportunity for connection and building a global citizenship?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it has been so much fun to have you on. You can tell I care about this a lot. I don't usually talk this much on my podcast, I promise, but we've had so much hard-earned wisdom, I guess, that has come from trying to do this and trying this model and that model. And at Amherst Montessori, which is I was ahead there for 4 years. we started a dual language program there as well. And I can tell you that there are a lot of different challenges, but it's so rewarding. So thank you for sharing your time with me. And
well, thank you so much for having me on.
And what's the name of your podcast?
My podcast is the Multilingual Montessori podcast.
Okay.
So I interview often conversations like this. I talk to parents, bilingual educators, researchers, authors, all about either multilingualism or Montessori, and sometimes the combination of both.
Oh, beautiful. Well, we'll have to check that out. Thank you so much for being with us. It's been a great day. And for our listeners, thank you for spending time with us today. Take a look at our website, greenspringcenter.org, to view the show notes from today's episode. And if you haven't already, please like us on Facebook and Instagram, and subscribe to our podcast, because we want to keep being able to do this for you. Your work is so important. I think it's the most important work in the world, and we're here to help. We're so much better together. Enjoy your week.